Okay, we're going to finish up chapter 5 today. And potentially move on to chapter 6. We'll see how we do. We might be able to. So you had a little bit of homework to do where you were looking at operant principles. So just as a review, classical conditioning is where you associate two things together. What are you associating together to bring about a response? You can just shout it out.
The U, CS, and the CS.
Good. The unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus you associate together to bring about the desired behavior, the desired response. Is reinforcement necessary in classical conditioning?
Yes.
Okay, when does the reinforcement occur? Before or after the response?
After.
In classical conditioning. Before the response, right. So if you think of Pavlov and his dog, the food is the reinforcement. So the food comes before the drooling, which is the response. How long typically can you wait before you initiate the reinforcement?
Not long.
Not long. Right away. Okay. Good. What happens if you stop giving the reinforcement? What will happen to the behavior? It will cease. What do you call that? Extinction. What happens if you bring that reinforcement back? Spontaneous recovery. Good. Okay. What do we call it when we can condition, for instance, little Albert to cry at the sight of a white rat? Do you remember the term? I only really mentioned it last time, so maybe you don't remember that. Well, it's called a conditioned emotional response. A conditioned emotional response. So that's when, it's not that we're just conditioning behaviors like pushing a lever or drooling or those kinds of things, but we're actually conditioning people's emotions. Right? We can induce fear and those kinds of things. And that's huge. That's big. Okay. We know that sometimes phobias are considered emotional responses, right? A phobia is a learned fear. It's irrational. And so we develop fears for all sorts of things. Sometimes we develop them vicariously, meaning we learn them from other people. Didn't really happen to us, happened to someone else, and we take that on or we internalize that ourselves. A conditioned emotional response. Oh, vicarious. Yep. So I'll put that word on the board. You learn it vicariously. That means through somebody else. Okay. So, last time then, we went on from classical conditioning to talk about operant conditioning. And while operant conditioning and classical conditioning are similar in a couple of ways, they're also different. Can you think of a way that classical and operant conditioning are similar to one another? The reinforcement? Okay, so what would be the similar part? Well, they both have reinforcement, right? So we use reinforcement both in classical conditioning and in operant conditioning. How are they different in terms of reinforcement?
One's before, one's after.
Yeah, which one's before and which one's after?
Operant is after.
You got it. Operant is after, classical is before. So in operant conditioning, the idea that a behavior is increased or decreased dependent upon the consequences that are given. So another thing that's similar between the two of them is that in neither case are we creating a new behavior. We didn't create drooling in Pavlov's dog. Dog already know how to drool. We just created what the dog drools to. We aren't creating a rat pushing a lever or a pigeon pecking at a particular word. The pecking, the pigeon already knows how to do. The rat already knows that it can push the lever. We don't teach them to do that. What we are doing is increasing the likelihood that they'll do that behavior again, or decreasing the likelihood that they'll do that behavior again. We're just increasing or decreasing the frequency of the behavior. We're not creating new behaviors. In either one of them, we're not creating new behaviors. So in operant conditioning, a response can be followed by a reinforcer, a punishment, or nothing at all. And so we talked a little bit about that reinforcement. Reinforcement is anything that increases the likelihood that the behavior is going to happen again. Anything that increases the likelihood that the behavior is going to happen again. But there are two kinds of reinforcement. One is positive reinforcement, where we are adding something positive, something desirable, something good in nature to increase the likelihood. Negative reinforcement is where we are taking something negative away. Usually it's pain or something unpleasant. We're taking that away to increase the likelihood that the behavior will happen again. So both of them increase the likelihood. What is it called when we try to decrease the likelihood? What's that consequence called? Punishment. Right, punishment. We know that punishment does work. It does. But it doesn't work as well as reinforcement. So even if you choose to use punishment, if you combine that also with reinforcement, you're going to have more success. You're going to have way more success. So, one of the things that operant conditioning initiates or sustains is the idea of superstitions. What's a superstition? Anybody superstitious? Are you superstitious? What does that mean, Aaron? If you're superstitious. Mm-hmm. You don't do something because you think something is going to happen. It can be, but there's superstitions in all cultures. Right? So maybe you think that something bad is going to happen if a black cat crosses your path. Or you don't walk under a ladder because bad things will happen. Or if you break a mirror, that's 7 years bad luck. Have you heard of these? Don't step on a crack, you'll break your mother's back. Exactly right. Have you heard of athletes in maybe Major League Baseball or whatever, if they're on a winning streak, maybe they don't wash their socks or something. What did you say? Same batting gloves. Right. Exactly. So why does that happen? So they do the behavior, right? And they win. That's the response. They win. Okay. And they do the same behavior again, and they win again. They just got reinforced for doing that behavior. They got positively reinforced for doing that behavior. So it's increasing the likelihood that they're going to do that behavior again. Now, when does it become a superstition? Because we know that batting gloves or dirty socks or beards probably don't affect one's ability to play the game or how the outcome of a game. But it's the impression that we have been reinforced in our behavior, so we continue that behavior. So superstitions can really be operant conditioning working for you. So a superstitious behavior is a behavior that is repeated because it seems to produce reinforcement, even though it's actually unnecessary. You can wear clean socks and probably do just fine. So that's a form of operant conditioning, though. So we talked about some examples of operant conditioning. And there's also different kinds of punishment as well. So punishment is where a behavior is followed by an aversive consequence, something negative, right? And it decreases the likelihood that that behavior is going to happen again. Right? Don't confuse punishment with negative reinforcement. They are not the same thing. In fact, they're opposite things. Now, you can punish in a couple of different ways. You can punish by application, which means you're presenting something aversive. You can punish by removal, which means you are removing or subtracting something, typically something positive or desirable. Did you bring your assignments for today? Okay, if you take those out, let's take a look at them. We're not going to go through all of them, but we'll go through a couple of them, and then I'll check the others. So we did the first one together. A student volunteers to answer a tough question in class, and the teacher comments favorably on the quality of the student's contribution. And so remember, the behavior is the thing that's underlined. So what I'm asking for is, what is the likelihood that that behavior is going to happen again? Is it increased or decreased? Arrow up or arrow down? So is it more likely or less likely that that student's going to volunteer again? More likely. Because what happened? What is the excuse me, what is the principle happening here? Is it positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, or nothing? Positive reinforcement, right. They received a favorable comment. Okay, so let's go to D, as in dog. Dad and Tot enter the checkout lane of the supermarket. When the child screams for candy, Dad pops a sucker in her mouth to quiet her down. Okay, so the behavior that we're looking at is the child screaming. So is it more likely or less likely that that child is going to scream again? More likely. More likely. So it's an arrow up. What is the principle that was being used here? Is it positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, or punishment? Right. That child has just been positively reinforced to scream. Right. Remember, whatever behavior that is reinforced right before that reinforcement is the behavior that's reinforced. Because you have to do it right away. So, if you are giving a sucker to a child who is crying, you are reinforcing the crying behavior. What would be a better option for the parent? What should the parent do? What? Give that child a smack. It might work, Neil, but what might be a more or a less aversive option?
Tell them to calm down.
Okay, tell them to calm down, and then what happens? When they calm down, what do? Then you treat them. So you wait for them to be good, and then you treat them. Right? And remember, that's when parents sort of miss the boat. Removal of the child? Yeah. From the situation. What do we call that? You know. It's timeout. That's a timeout. Removal from the situation is a timeout. Timeouts are not meant to be punishments. That's another thing that parents sometimes miss the boat on. Timeouts are not meant to be punishments. Okay? Sometimes parents use them as punishments, but that's not what they were intended for. They're intended just to remove the child from a situation where the stimulation is so great so that they can calm down, right? And then enter the situation again and try to figure out a better way of acting. It's not meant to be a punishment, but parents use it as that all the time. Okay? It's just meant to take away stimulation. And timeouts should not be used for extensive periods of time. I mean, if you put a kid in a timeout for an hour, are you really doing what you want to do? No. Yes, 1 minute per age of year. Yeah, year of age, right. Let's do F. A student has a terrible headache after an intense preparation period for a test. He takes 2 aspirin to make it go away. So it's taking the 2 aspirin that we're looking at. Okay. So is it more likely or less likely that this student is going to take aspirin in the future? More likely.